25 of the DALLÄSTHETIC podcast, and today joining me is Ariel Bowmam. Thanks for coming along, Ariel.
Thanks for having me.
So you have an upcoming exhibition at the Ro2 Art Pop-Up Gallery in downtown that we're super excited about, called Wondrous Creatures and the Prehistoric Circus. It's kind of a combination of two different shows.
Yeah.
Give us just a capsule, just a tiny bit of a blurb on what this is about.
So Wondrous Creatures is my most recent series, and it's actually from my thesis exhibition at the University of Florida, where I just finished my master's in fine arts. And so these are all ceramic sculptures based on that thesis research, which centered on combining prehistoric animals with the 18th century picturesque aesthetic. And so you'll see those pieces as animals in these sort of fantasy timeline settings of French palace rooms. And then the Prehistoric Circus is an older series that I actually applied to graduate school with, that I worked on for a couple of years, that sort of led to this last series I did, the Wondrous Creatures. All of these series kind of lead to each other.
And you were, where did you go to undergrad?
I did my undergraduate work at the Kansas City Art Institute in Missouri.
That's right. But you've got a background in Texas.
I do, yes. I grew up here. Both my parents live here, and they're both artists. And so I kind of grew up around art a lot and going to all the Dallas museums and Fort Worth as well. We went to all the museums when I was a kid.
Sort of know how that works, growing up in the arts as well.
Yeah.
And you've entered various like juried exhibitions over the years, because I do remember one of the first things I've ever seen, or the first thing I saw of yours, was at a Plano exhibition, the 150, which is I guess 150 miles of Plano people can apply, and I was a juror for that show, and I remember the piece pretty vividly you placed in that exhibition. And then you went off to college and then to grad school, and we get to meet again, so that's exciting.
Yeah, it's nice to be back in Dallas, definitely.
So your work is it's not only complex in its in just the theory behind it, but you did a lot of research and a lot of research going into it and preparation. And I've got some images of some of the paintings that you use for inspiration, and then this. I guess, what is this sculpture?
So this is a sculpture by Anton Louis Barrier. He's a French 19th century sculptor who was part of a group of sculptors called the Animaliers. They were these bronze artists who were depicting animals as their work, and his work was kind of the first artwork that centered on animal subject matter that was featured in the Salon.
Oh, wow.
And so that was kind of the entry into animals being considered legitimate subject matter in the fine art world.
I had no idea of that.
Yeah,
wow.
And so he was really bringing a lot of exotic animals to people's attention, but also he was sort of changing the way people viewed nature, because at that time everyone sort of viewed nature under their control. It was very much something that was within our control, and his animals were all depicted in these sort of scenes of violence or terror that sort of tweaked the way people looked at nature a little bit.
Wow, they saw that the animals actually have something going on.
Yeah, that they have sort of an emotional capacity to them, and also a fierceness and an uncontrollability, especially those lions and other animals fighting with each other. There's this sense of danger in them that is not how people were thinking about nature at the time.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And what drew you to prehistoric creatures?
The prehistoric creatures I actually came to in undergrad. I was given an assignment to go to the Nelson Atkins Museum there in Kansas City and pick a piece to make an artwork based on. And so I found there a Greek lion that had been made by a Greek artist who had never seen a lion before. And so the sculpture had like the rib cage of a horse and the hindquarters of a goat, but it still kind of looked like a lion.
Oh,
and
this
so,
is, I'm sorry to interrupt. This Walton Ford is fantastic.
It is, yeah. So this is another big influence of mine, just because Walton Ford is amazing at using history, I feel like art history, but also the history of the animals that he paints, to make these sort of fantasy stories happen, and I'm really inspired by that.
I hadn't thought of it, and Walton Ford is a painter that I first discovered maybe 6 years ago. I went to Frieze Art Fair in New York and saw this massive tiger, like unbelievable painting. and it just burned an impression in me. I loved it, and bought the book, his monograph, and
cool.
really enjoy it. And I didn't think of the connection until I saw that image in your kind of like inspiration book.
Yeah.
And you've got a rhino pulling some type of carriage or something, and
that definitely the rhino is a big influence on me. It's one of my favorite animals. It's an animal that I feel like a spiritual kinship with, I guess.
Really, why?
I think just because they're very determined. They kind of just charge at everything that they want to do, and I'm really a lot like that. And so I don't usually wait around to do things. I just do them. And so I've always loved rhinos too, just aesthetically as animals. And then that particular Walton Ford piece was inspired by the Lisbon rhinoceros that was the first rhino ever to come to Europe that Albert Dürer did his woodcut, his famous woodcut of. That's also an inspiration of mine. And so I love seeing how one animal can inspire tons of different artists throughout time.
Oh, yeah.
And that sort of influence that carries through not only people who influence me, but way back in history too.
And then, you know, Renaissance art and architecture and rooms and design, that we'll see some images next. You went to Paris, you went to the Getty.
Did a lot of traveling.
Oh, and Beth Kavanagh. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Beth Kavanagh is a huge influence of mine. From when I first started working in clay, I had never seen anybody work in clay the way she works in clay.
Unbelievable.
And as soon as I saw her making these giant animals, I was like, I want to major in ceramics. I want to do that. I want to make animals out of clay.
Yeah, her work is unbelievable.
Yeah, and I got to be an assistant for her while I was in grad school. I went to Montana over the summer and assisted her in her studio and got to know her, which was really amazing. She's a wonderful person.
That's terrific. I've known her work for a little while.
Yeah, and this painting here, the Frederick Edward Church painting, is in the Dallas Museum of Art, and it's something I always saw as a kid growing up, and so I fell in love with these romantic landscapes also. Which are, again, all about the power of nature and sort of changing people's perspective on nature. So I've had these influences, I think, for a long time.
And that was one of the most famous paintings in the world for a while, I believe.
Yeah.
And the most popular painting in
Especially
the DMA.
when it came out, Arctic exploration was a really big, in the 19th century, that was something that was really changing the way people viewed nature, too, to be able to go to the Arctic and discover the Arctic.
Like the space age in the 60s.
Very much, yeah. Very, very similar.
Cool. So in grad school, you really embarked on this like really ambitious project of Wondrous Creatures. And are there 5 in total?
There are 5 in total, and they each sort of represent different animals that I would say are lesser known prehistoric animals. Gomphotheres, which were prehistoric elephants that had shovel tusks, aquatic sloths like that piece there. That was a semi-aquatic sloth that lived off the coast of South America. And so I chose animals specifically that were not necessarily going to be recognized by everybody. I didn't choose woolly mammoths or saber cats, which are probably the most popular, but...
I noticed that reminded me of the iceberg painting.
Oh yeah, the foam and the small worlds. Yeah, I definitely am really in that iceberg painting the artifacts left behind by the explorers, the broken ship mast. I really think that I'm interested as much in human fossils is kind of how I think about them as I am in the animal fossils. But I love decorative objects, especially from the 18th century, and part of that I think comes from growing up with my dad, who restores antique furniture. And so I grew up in his shop around 18th century French gilded things with scroll work, and I've just always loved that aesthetic. But I also love the idea that over time we leave behind these things, these objects that are actually real indicative of our aesthetics at the time.
And I noticed within like the bubbles and the sloth, and I tried to get an image of that at the bottom of the clock. There's like a city.
Yes.
Down there.
Yeah, so each piece in the Wondrous Creatures series sort of has these small worlds, I call them, that are miniature ruins of human civilization that are purposefully put there to kind of play with not only the scale and sort of immensity of the animal, but also to play with your idea of what's going on, your understanding of the scene. Because my whole sort of goal with Wondrous Creatures was to initiate wonder, which is a tricky emotion to play with, and it's really all about a feeling of surprise mixed with sort of admiration. And then all of that is usually in reaction to something beautiful or unexpected or inexplicable. And so kind of walking around those pieces, you see a strange animal, but then you also walk around again and you see a tiny world. So there's all of these first, second, and third realizations that you come to as you experience the piece. And that was important to me to reflect kind of how I feel about scientific discovery and the things that we think we know. And how that keeps getting changed every time we discover something new.
And it's so interesting because, you know, you've got the animals up against like a clock or with, you know, a trunk of clothes or whatever it might be. And you get kind of an idea for their scale in relation to those objects.
Yes.
But then when you see that third world, it's almost like you're discovering humanity again.
Yeah.
And almost like this was the real world. And what were these weird creatures down below? Yeah,
so I love that second guessing that happens, that you try and understand the scene, and no matter how many times you go through it, there's something else changing your understanding. Because I feel like that's what these animals really did, and that's why I'm so interested in them in the first place, is that prehistoric animals are something that changed the whole way we understand ourselves as a species.
Oh, yeah.
We thought we were the center of the universe, and then we discovered this thing that had been here millions of years ago. And so I'm just interested in that sort of revelation that occurred for us as a species, and sort of reviving that by depicting the animals in a new way. A lot of people may have seen fossils like this in a museum, but it's a whole different experience to see them fleshed out.
And you had studied, you know, all the fossils, and you've even taught at museums, correct?
I did, yeah. So while I was at University of Florida doing my grad work, I volunteered with the Florida Museum of Natural History in the fossil lab preparing fossils. So I got to actually touch them and handle them and learn how to preserve them. And then I also worked in exhibits, creating the displays, because I was really interested in also making those tables and the pieces for my thesis show feel like a museum exhibit. And so when they're all installed together, I do it so that it feels like you're in a diorama hall. So that each table is kind of like one of those diorama windows at the American Natural History Museum or something like that. I'm really interested in museum displays and how they put spotlights on the animals themselves, and referencing that in my installations.
And that's something you got probably from your father as well, who's been working with museums.
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up just around a lot of museum restoration in general, and he does a lot of conservation and works with a lot of other conservators. And so there's definitely, I think the thing I got most from him is probably a fascination with the past and an appreciation of things from the past.
Oh, nice.
And also animals. My dad is a huge wildlife conservationist in the area. He was chairman of the Mound Foundation in Flower Mound and preserves native prairies and trees.
Oh, that's terrific.
He works on the tree board to preserve those things. And so I was always out in nature with him as a kid too, measuring trees and trying to save them, and growing up with a lot of animals.
And this is a dodo bird, right?
Yes. So this is from the Prehistoric Circus series. And I think the most fun thing about that series was that it really let me introduce my own sense of humor to the work. Where in the past I had been kind of afraid to share that side of me. And this stack of elephants here was also based on Dumbo, which is, all my influences seem to stem from my childhood, I think, either from how I grew up or animals that I had or movies that I watched, books that my dad read me as a kid. All of those seem to kind of work their way back in.
Oh, yeah. I see that a lot with art. Childhood influences tend to really, really show up in later work.
Yeah, and the aesthetics of that Circus series too brought in a lot more color to my work. In the past, I had been making things real monochromatic. At the end of undergrad, all the animals were kind of dull, I would say, and then bringing in all this color was a really new thing for me, and it made the pieces fun. Yeah,
I mean they're a blast. This is an older one that led up to the circus, and then next. Actually, there'll be an image of what you're working on now, which are the, what's the series called?
This is the Timekeepers series.
Timekeepers, okay.
So initially I was, when I first got out of undergrad or out of grad school and moved back here, I thought, you know, what am I going to do now? I just finished this huge, heavy series that was really hard to do, that took, you know, a year and a half to create. And what I needed to do was make smaller pieces that I could ship to these shows I was getting invited to all over the country. I was getting these invites to shows at galleries, and the shipping costs on those big pieces is exponential. So I was trying to come up with a series I could do that was a smaller scale, but that would let me sort of still do the amount of investigation I like to do with my work. And so I came across these Louis XIV decorative mantle clocks, and all of them feature some kind of exotic animal. So there's a lion with the clock on its back, or a rhino, or a bull. And they're these elaborately sculpted mantle clocks.
Wow.
And they were
sort of work.
Yeah, they do. And so I thought of replacing those exotic animals with these prehistoric animals, which I feel like have the same sort of presence as far as intriguing people as the rhino did when it first came to Europe.
Yeah.
Like that was something no one had ever seen before. And these animals that are prehistoric have that effect. And so I'm replacing them, but I'm also messing with the clocks. So I found a great place in Dallas, Promenade Clocks, and the guy there helped me to make the clocks run backwards. And so the clocks in these pieces will, if you watch the second hand, they run backwards at a normal rate. Yeah. And so again, a little bit of my sense of humor, but also, again, that reverence for past and that thinking about, just constantly thinking about the past and mulling on that, and how that sort of changes the way we think about the future.
It ends up being contemplative, you know, spending time with these sculptures. Yeah,
and I think that the second hand is a little bit subtle, so people don't notice right away that the clock is moving backwards.
Right.
And then when they do, they get this sort of treat for sticking with the piece long enough to notice that. I usually try and embed those little like Easter eggs in my pieces for people who really want to investigate, like the tables and the Wondrous creatures having those figureheads that are the recognizable prehistoric animals, the dodo, the saber cat. So if you even take time to look at the furniture, you start seeing more and more.
And what's mind-boggling to me is that these really elegant tables that are gilded and have these animals on the legs, those are all porcelain as well.
Yes, they are. That was a big part of my thesis research as well, was trying to make displays that were different than just the white box. I had gotten past just placing an animal on a pedestal that had no context, no life of its own outside of that pedestal. And so I wanted to create an environment for them to exist in and objects for them to interact with. And so, of course, I wanted the tables to be clay. I feel like I just want everything to be clay.
Yeah.
And part of that is me and my own desire for challenge in the studio. I love trying to trick people or fool the eye in some way. And so all those tables that you've seen on those other images too, those are all clay.
It's so exciting.
It's really fun. And I'm not the only one doing it either. There's a lot of people making ceramic furniture. But it's an interesting challenge because the clay is actually much stronger than you'd think.
Yeah.
Fired fully to temperature, it's vitrified, it's glass-like, it's very strong and can actually hold a surprising amount of weight. And so once I figured out sort of the logistics of it, I had a lot of fun also designing my own carvings on the furniture to be those references to prehistoric things, to natural history objects.
It's really wonderful. Well, we're short on time. Is there anything else about your process that people might find intriguing?
Yeah, so definitely one big aspect of my process is the actual reconstruction of the animals themselves from skeletons.
Wow.
Like I don't have any reference really besides what other artists have done to recreate these animals. And I'm definitely not the first one to recreate prehistoric animals. There's a lot of other paleo artists in the world. It's been going on since probably the 1800s. Ever since we found these fossils, there have been artists trying to reconstruct the animals.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so I look at their images for reference, but I also do a lot of fossil research on my own. These are some images from my research trip to the La Brea tar pits. And then I've also been to the Paris Natural History Museum. And at the Florida Museum, I had access to the collections to really get into some of these fossils. But by looking at them and then also looking at modern day animals that have similar anatomy, I use a technique called comparative anatomy to create a believable reconstruction. And so a lot of that is examining not only the prehistoric anatomy of these skeletons, but also modern day animals anatomy.
It's interesting because some of the animals are not what I'd expect them to be, but it's your interpretation through science. And
yeah, I mean, as best I can, a lot of observation. And this was one of my favorite galleries at the Paris Natural History Museum, was the Gallery of Comparative Anatomy. And so this was all the known mammal species skeletons in one room next to each other. So you can see the difference between an Indian rhino and an African rhino.
Yeah.
You can see all these subtleties in their anatomical differences. And so that kind of scientific aspect of my work is really important as far as you believing that that animal was a real thing.
Wow. That's really amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I can't wait to see the exhibition together. We will have that open beginning this weekend. And then
Yeah.
the exhibition will run actually into April, towards the end of April. But the opening reception, I hope everyone will join us, is on March 16th from 7 to 10 p.m.
Perfect.
And it's extraordinary. It's wondrous. So
Great.
hopefully we'll see everybody at the show. And that's it for today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.